Today, we're taking a completely mind-bending look at one of history's absolute greatest military disruptions. We're talking about a staggering, monumental shift in the global balance of power that standard Western civ classes just completely miss. We constantly learn about the fall of Rome or the rise of modern Europe, but right there in the middle, hidden away in the 7th century, is an event that entirely rewrote the map of the world in less than a decade.
Okay, let's dive right into this because, just think about the sheer impossible scale of this scenario. How in the world does a technologically disadvantaged army of just 15,000 men defeat two massive 1,000-year-old empires simultaneously? It sounds like bad historical fiction, right? You just don't attack two superpowers at once, especially when you are vastly, vastly outnumbered. But that is exactly what happened. To really wrap our heads around this unstoppable force, we first need to understand the immovable objects they were up against.
Section 1. Two exhausted ancient empires. So before we even talk about the conquerors, we absolutely have to talk about Rome and Persia. They were the undisputed titans of the ancient world. We're talking advanced technology, heavy armor, incredible wealth, and sprawling populations. But they had a massive problem. For exactly 700 years, these two empires had been locked in a brutal, exhausting cycle of warfare. It actually all kicked off way back in 53 BC when a greedy Roman politician named Crassus decided to illegally invade Persia for gold. Well, it ended terribly for him. He was actually captured and the Persians executed him by pouring molten gold right down his throat. And that one gruesome event triggered literally 7 centuries of back-and-forth bloodletting.
And this brilliantly illustrates how fragile even massive empires can become, all thanks to the butterfly effect. Just follow this bizarre chain of events with me for a second. Indonesian fishermen island hopped across the Indian Ocean, and they eventually brought rice cultivation to Africa and the Middle East. But, as you probably know, growing rice requires flooded fields. Well, those flooded fields bred malaria-carrying mosquitoes, which completely devastated life expectancies in the region. Throw the bubonic plague into that exact same mix in the mid-6th century, and the populations, economies, and military manpower of both Rome and Persia absolutely collapsed. So this centuries-long blood feud kicked off at the Battle of Karhai, but honestly, it was those plagues that really hollowed out their populations. Then, right when both empires are at their absolute weakest, they decide to engage in a devastating 26-year war starting in 602 AD. By the time that war finally ends in 628, both Rome and Persia are utterly, completely exhausted. They're just barely scraping by with depleted armies and shattered economies. The stage is perfectly set for a massive disruption.
The contrast between these two sides is literally staggering. On one hand, you've got Rome and Persia with 21 centuries of combined imperial history. They've got heavily armored elite cavalry, massive remaining infrastructures, and advanced engineering, stuff like indoor plumbing. On the other side, the early Arab forces. They've been unified as a single political entity for less than a year. They have no rivers, virtually no agricultural capacity to support giant armies, and they are vastly outnumbered and technologically outmatched. It is a true David versus Goliath scenario, but on a geopolitical scale.
Section 2. The Rise of Khalid. Khalid ibn al-Walid was a 7th century Arab warrior who actually initially fought against the Prophet Muhammad before converting to Islam. But after his conversion, he quickly proved himself to be, without a doubt, one of the top 3 greatest battlefield commanders in human history. Just look at how he handled his very first command at the Battle of Mu'tah. It literally plays out like a brilliant Hollywood heist movie. The Arab forces were heavily outnumbered by a Roman army and were just losing badly. Khalid gets handed command right in the middle of this disaster. So what does he do? Under the cover of darkness, he sneaks a group of his men completely out of sight behind a hill. The next day, he gives those same men new banners and marches them over the hill into view. He just kept cycling the exact same guys behind the hill with different banners, making the Romans think this massive, endless wave of reinforcements had arrived. Then at night, he had every single man light several extra campfires. The Romans were so spooked by these fake phantom numbers that Khalid was able to safely retreat his outmatched army without a scratch.
Section 3. Dismantling the Persian Empire.
So with Arabia unified in less than a year, Khalid takes his tiny force of 15,000 men and sets his sights north on Iraq, marching right into the teeth of the mighty Persian military. His maneuvering at the city of Anbar is almost impossible to comprehend. The Persians sent 60,000 troops his way, split into 3 armies of 20,000. Now Khalid knew his 15,000 men couldn't beat 60,000 all at once, so he splits his own army into 3 5,000-man units.
He gives them a date and a highly specific time to arrive at a location, and sends them on 3 completely separate paths through the featureless desert at night. I mean, think about trying to coordinate that today with your friends in cars without GPS. It's basically impossible. Yet Khalid's 3 units converged at the exact same moment in the dark, ambushing the first sleeping Persian army. Then he did it again for the second army, and again for the third. He completely wiped out 60,000 Persians, piece by piece, suffering almost 0 losses.
Now what's really fascinating here is how the rest of the world reacted to Khalid's unbelievable winning streak. By the time he reached Firaz, right on the border of the 2 empires, the Romans and Persians, who, remember, had literally just spent 700 years brutally butchering each other, looked at Khalid and said, okay, we need to team up. These 2 ancient enemies actually formed an alliance to field a massive combined force of 150,000 men against Khalid's tiny army of just 15,000.
So, facing literal 10-to-1 odds, Khalid pulls off this absolutely brilliant, devastating maneuver. He politely backs his army away from a river crossing, essentially inviting the massive Roman-Persian army to cross. Once 50,000 of them were over the river, he unleashed what's known as compression tactics. He basically used his agile light cavalry to conduct repeated, really shallow charges into the enemy lines, immediately pulling back every single time. This caused the massive, heavily armored Roman and Persian infantry to instinctively flinch and bunch up. He packed them so incredibly tightly together they couldn't even lift their arms to swing their swords. When panic inevitably set in and 50,000 men tried to stampede back across that river all at once, they crushed each other. In the end, 50,000 Romans and Persians died. Khalid lost just 200 men.
Section 4. The Battle of Yarmouk. By this point, the Roman Emperor Heraclius is utterly terrified, so he launches a massive counterattack in Syria, which culminates in an epic 6-day clash. The stakes on the plains of Yarmouk were just astronomical. 120,000 heavily armored Romans met a newly expanded Arab army of 40,000. This wasn't some quick, clever ambush. This was a brutal, desperate 6-day slog. The Arab forces were pushed to the absolute brink of destruction. These turning points are just incredibly cinematic. I mean, on day 3, the heavy Roman attack actually broke the Arab lines. The men genuinely began to turn and run. But the Arab women back in the camp, they completely tore down their own tents, grabbed the heavy wooden tent posts, and physically charged their own retreating husbands and brothers. They shamed them and literally forced them back into the fight, stabilizing the entire line. It's wild. By day 4, Khalid's pure genius really shone through as he perfectly redeployed his agile light cavalry to save his collapsing flanks. And then on the final day, day 6, Khalid secretly sent a small detachment to capture the only bridge behind the Roman army, trapping 120,000 men against a steep ravine, before launching a devastating final cavalry charge. The Roman military in the entire region was permanently shattered.
Section 5. The Conquest of Jerusalem. So the crucial point is, with the Roman field army completely shattered, Khalid's forces push onward to Jerusalem. And the military narrative really slows down here, because the taking of this holy city reveals a profound, almost unbelievable cultural contrast between the 2 leaders meeting to discuss the surrender. On one side, representing Rome, is Archbishop Sophronius. He's draped in red robes, absolutely covered in heavy gold jewelry, wearing expensive perfume, and being carried on a litter by his servants while being fanned. Riding out to meet him is the Muslim ruler, Caliph Omar. The caliph is dressed in mended rags, leading a single camel by the reins, mostly because he and his servant are taking turns riding, so neither one gets too tired. The culture shock here was just total. Archbishop Sophronius literally looked at the most powerful man in the world, a man whose armies had just dismantled 2 global superpowers, and asked in total bewildered disbelief, "You've just conquered Iraq and Syria and all of Palestine. How is it you're so poor?" The Romans simply couldn't fathom a conqueror who wasn't in it to plunder gold and enrich himself. And that totally humble approach translated directly into how the Muslims actually governed their new conquests through completely unprecedented surrender terms. Instead of the traditional Roman method, sacking the city, assaulting the populace, and enslaving whoever survived, Caliph Omar left the city's wealth completely untouched. He even allowed the Roman politicians to safely leave with whatever they could physically carry. When he was invited to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the caliph refused, knowing that if he prayed there, his followers would later turn it into a mosque, and he wanted it preserved as a Christian site. When he saw that the Romans had turned the Jewish Temple Mount into a literal garbage dump, the caliph fell to his knees and dug 500 years of trash out by hand. And finally, upon discovering that the Romans had completely purged the city of Jews, he actively invited 80 Jewish families back to restore their presence in Jerusalem.
Section 6. A warrior's final rest.
Following the conquest of Jerusalem, Caliph Omar started to get a bit nervous. He feared that Khalid's immense popularity and his totally undefeated record gave him way too much political influence. So he forced his greatest general into early retirement. Khalid died just a few years later, in his bed, at the age of 50. And his final words are so haunting, perfectly reflecting the deeply human tragedy of a warrior who achieved near superhuman feats. He said, "You cannot put your hand anywhere on my body without touching a combat wound. It was my dream that God would let me die as a man on the field of battle. Here I am, in a bed, dying like a cow." It's an incredibly somber, quiet end to a man whose very existence was basically a thunderstorm of military genius.
Which really leaves us with this final provocative thought for today's explainer. We started this whole thing by asking how 15,000 men could possibly beat two massive empires. But looking at the plagues, the 7 centuries of exhausting wars, and the brilliant tactical audacity of Khalid, we really have to ask ourselves, does true historical disruption actually come from overwhelming power, or does it come from the sheer audacity of those who realize the giants are already exhausted? Thank you so much for exploring this massive geopolitical shift with me today. It for sure makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about how the modern map was really drawn. Keep questioning the history you've been taught, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.